All right. Thank you very much for joining us today. And I'm welcoming here Jason J. Smart, a journalist with the Kyiv Post and a political consultant. He has worked on 2 presidential elections in the past and is considered an expert in foreign policy and politics in North America, South America, Europe, and Asia. So getting into the real meat here, polling can only tell us so much about what those in the war zone are thinking. From your contacts, from the people you talk to, both at the Kyiv Post and other places throughout the world here, what is the mood of citizens of Ukraine about the war? Is support really robust across all the regions?
So the attitude in Ukraine as a whole remains very positive, and very, I would say, aggressive towards Russia. There's no desire to pull back. I'm not seeing any indications the population's had war fatigue. I mean, they're tired of course, the constant, air raid warnings and things like this. It is exhausting. But to give up or some sort of desire to call it quits, it's non-existent. I've not met a single person yet who has even suggested that. The population remains very committed to the idea of defeating Russia and expelling the Russian Federation from Ukraine. And the reason for that is simple. I think that one, there's more than just patriotism or ideology. It's because Russia and all the regions that it has occupied engages in significant human rights violations, whether it's the murder, rape, torture, disappearance, forced conscription to the Russian military, and other things that occur. And they realize that if they were to be taken by Russia, their lives will be ruined. They will become essentially slaves to the Russians. Whatever Russia chooses to do to them will happen. So the only way to prevent that from happening is to continue to resist. And that's what the Ukrainians are doing today. I mean, the fact is nobody wants to be a slave. And if Russia shows up and comes to town, I think it's very safe to say they will do exactly like they've done everywhere else they've taken power. And so they understand what that means and what that looks like. And it's something that they wish to avoid.
How much support is there in Ukraine for Russia in all this? How has that changed since, prior to 2022? And how has the war really changed those sentiments overall?
I think it's fair to say that it's radically changed. I mean, no, I can't say people loved Russia, liked Russia before. I think there's different degrees of dislike in it. At this point, I could say that people hate it. I mean, absolutely hate it. With such a degree, it's hard to describe. And I have not met anyone to the contrary so far. And it's not just Western Ukraine, Eastern Ukraine even more so, I think, because it's not just theoretical. It's they've lived under it. They're dealing with refugees. They're dealing with the problems that come from this. And there is no sympathy for Russia whatsoever. I mean, which I think was a huge mistake of Russia, is that historically there had not been a wonderful relationship, but it had not been, a disastrous thing. At this point, it's absolute pure hatred. And so that's something that Russia brought upon itself.
How much has the sentiment in places like Serbia and Hungary really impacted support for Ukraine? Are they really hurting support overall?
I think in the case of, Serbia, it's a little bit different. Serbia has always been the younger brothers of the Russians. For more than 100 years, they've had that reputation. And the reason for that is simple, is that they have a lot in common. They do identify with it on many different levels. We've seen the protest in Serbia. We've seen the statements of the Serbian government. And we've also seen the activities of Russia in Serbia. Now, that being said, at the same time, I think that when you get to Hungary, it's a little bit different. I think Hungary is a country that at least its leader, I shouldn't say the country. The leader of the country is pursuing a politic which is populist in nature, nationalist in nature, and one that is inherently opposed to the European Union and European togetherness. So I think the reason he supports Russia, or would be perceived to be open to Russia, I cannot say he supports Russia, he's perceived to be more open to Russia, is because he is trying to once again play the role of being the outsider. He's like this. He's a little bit different from everyone else in Europe. And once again, I think Russian propaganda, though, in Serbia and Hungary both, is very effective. It does portray themselves as being an Orthodox country, as Russia's an Orthodox country, a Christian country, a country of traditional values, a country that is opposing the Western liberalism. And that's something that I think appeals to a lot of people in both Serbia and in Hungary, as false as it is. I mean, that is Russian propaganda. Russia is not a conservative country. And I think what people often get confused by is the viral hatred of everything, for instance, gay, in Russia is not due to like a deep love of Christian values. It's simply because they hate gays. Don't be confused. It means that it's because it's based on some sort of a critical interpretation of the Bible. It's not. They just inherently hate gays. So they feel the same way about a lot of groups too. And it has nothing to do with religion. And so it might be used as justification, and that might appeal to some people. But the fact is, it has nothing to do with that. It's not because they are some sort of a city on the hilltop spreading this truth to the world. It's couldn't be further from the truth.
You've been a vocal proponent of U.S. aid to Ukraine, and considering your work in American political spheres, including for prior Republican presidential candidates. Are you surprised by Republican reluctance to provide aid to Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, I got to say that is quite shocking to me. I would never have imagined the party of Reagan would have gone the direction of, slowing down the advancement of freedom internationally. If we want to be more critical, I would say doing things that would be inherently beneficial to the Putin regime. And when we talk about the Putin regime, I think it's very clear that there's a link. I mean, not just a link, but the fact is that they're partners of Iran and North Korea. I mean, Iran is supplying weapons to the Russians, as are the North Koreans. And in both cases, this just means that, and they're doing tests. We know that the North Koreans are testing their weapons via the Russians in Ukraine. We know the Iranians have changed their drones due to the tests they've done inside of Ukraine. So it means you're actually helping Iran and North Korea as well. So how the party of Reagan went from this very bold vision of America's role in the world, as well as for protecting freedom and democracy, to be a party that is, fighting over, let's talk about this. I mean, the total amount of money that the U.S. spends on Ukraine works out to about 0.3% of the entire U.S. budget. It works out to less than 5% of the total defense budget. And with that money, we're able to degrade the Russian military more than 50%, to destroy more than 60% of tanks, have killed or injured hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers. And we are also able to affront our enemies in the region, Iran, North Korea, Russia. And why we would ever second guess that, to me, is actually phenomenal. It seems quite obvious that this is a great return on investment, given that it promotes U.S. national security, but also helps to counter enemies such as Iran, which is financing Hezbollah and other terrorist organizations, which have an impact not just there, also in Latin America, also globally, and including Africa and other places. So the fact that we're able to come to a heads with our enemies in Ukraine for such a cheap amount of money, such a little amount of money, and to directly challenge them, to me, it's an amazing opportunity. Reagan, in his worst day of life, would have never said, no, let's cut off the money or let's make a political show of this. He would have realized that this is strategically bad for America if Putin or other dictators feel that they are somehow bolstered by the actions of the Republicans in Congress.
It's pretty clear, at least to me, that these dictators throughout the world are at least coordinating in some way, shape, or form, and looking at what each other are doing and saying, look, it's pretty clear there's some weakness here that we can exploit. Do you think Trump Republicans can be brought on board with Ukraine aid in any way, shape, or form? And if so, how?
So there's been polling on this, and so I can cite that. So we have found that Trump Republicans, MAGA Republicans, are the least supportive of Ukraine. Only about 9% support further assistance for Ukraine. What is the most compelling argument to them when you test messaging is two different arguments. One is sociological nature. That is, once they understand how the situation is in Ukraine, it's not simply Russian speakers versus non-Russian speakers or something like that. Once they hear the statistic, which is accurate, that over 90,000 cases of rape and sexual assault have been filed in Ukrainian prosecutor's office, mostly against children and the elderly, against Russian soldiers. The Russians have raped their way across the country, and the biggest demographic that's actually been targeted is children. So the Russian sexual assault of little children is something I think is pretty shocking for Americans. And we know that in Poland that does change views, but it's true. It's not invented. It's a fact. I don't think people realize what happens when Russia shows up in town. It's not like they just come and change the language instruction in school. It's they rape to death children. And the reason they rape to death old ladies, by the way, is the same thing. Is we've captured Russian soldiers and they've been interrogated. In interrogation, they say that the reason they go for the old ladies is because they can't run away as fast. So that's what Russia's into. And so I don't know how a political party that believes it is a right-leaning party or party of Reagan or a Christian party would identify with that's something that we want to happen because I want to stick it to Joe Biden by showing I don't support Ukraine. It's absurd. But more to that point, I don't think that they realize, and Poland shows it, it's important they realize, what happens to Christians, especially evangelicals, under Russian occupation. I've interviewed, and you can find it on Kyiv Post website, just Google probably evangelical pastor or Christian pastor and my name in Kyiv Post, and you'll probably find an article where I've interviewed a evangelical pastor who's captured by the Russians. They hooked electrodes up to his balls. They lit him up a number of times. They've tortured other people all over his congregants because they said that they were Russian or American spies. And the reason American spies is because typically evangelical churches have seed money or seed churches which they start in other countries. And so there's financing the evangelical churches or paying for the Bibles, whatever it is, over in Ukraine. So once they show up, because they have the connection to America, it's specifically out of any group, the evangelicals and the Protestants as a whole, who get the most worst brunt of the torture from the Russians by far. And the number of videos that have come out of the pastors talking about this is phenomenal. I mean, I'm sure there's tons of websites about it that you can find. But they specifically target evangelicals. And the Russians, force them to convert. If they don't want to convert, they beat them. Once again, using electric rods or using electricity as a whole as a method of torture is very popular, as is bludgeoning people to death. And as I said, the evangelicals are first on the list.
That's insane. I don't even see how the support for Russia has gotten so strong, honestly. What about the other side of the aisle, the Democrats? They seem to have a little bit of reluctance to really provide full-throated support for Ukraine, with them making the most of those aid opportunities. Considering the guidance of people like Jake Sullivan, are Democrats likely to continue supporting Ukraine even at this current slow rate, or can they be encouraged to increase it?
So I think there's a couple of things going on with that. And at this point, it's changed. Initially, I think that the Democrats, and when I say Democrats, I want to be clear, it's Jake Sullivan and the White House and those who advise him. I think that they have a completely warped view of what is going on, what Russia is as a country. Unfortunately, they believe it is a country that you can make a deal with, or it's a country that is, going to become too upset if we were to send too many weapons too fast. And I've talked to General Ben Hodges about this a number of times, and he's always said exactly the same thing, which is the White House has never said, and recently they started saying, but up until then they did not, for more than a year and a half, they want Ukraine to win. They said they want to help Ukraine defend itself, but what does that mean? But more to that point, as General Hodges has said, it's not our job, it's not the Americans' job, it's not his job as a general, or when he was the top general in Europe, it was not his job to worry about what upsets Vladimir Putin. And why the White House worries so much about upsetting Putin, to me, is just phenomenal. Listen, Putin does not have the capacity to really hurt the United States. There's nothing we have to worry about. And you know what? I see nothing to be lost whatsoever if we do upset him. Throughout this war, we've dragged out since 2014. We've dragged out. First, it was giving Javelin missiles, which are defensive, or used against tanks. Then it was for other sorts of arms. And then eventually it became tanks. Can we send tanks? Then it became long-range weapons, and then F-16s. But over time, it's progressed and progressed. The White House has said, yes, we can send it. Yes, we can send it. Because they realize, really, yes, the Russians are going to complain, but they can't do anything about it. So if they can't do anything about it, what are we afraid of? We have to crush them. And they have to understand what it looks like when the United States decides you shouldn't do something, is that we can really, lay the smackdown. They don't get a choice in this. The Russians don't get a choice in what the United States does, and they can't intimidate us by, what they want to do. The United States is an infinitely more powerful country than Russia will ever be. Russia, keep in mind, it might be physically large, but it only has 140 million people. The U.S. has 330 million. Their economy is the size of Portugal's. And just imagine it. It's before the war, it's smaller than the size of Italy's. Today's estimated about the size of Portugal's. It's nothing. It is completely nothing. And the United States could readily wreck them. And so why we worry about upsetting them, to me, is absurd. The United States is a superpower, the only superpower. And the projection of power is something that has a positive impact, not only with how it is perceived by Iran, North Korea, but also by China. And if we wish to defeat China in the long run, we have to be able to project power. And fearing what Putin might do is the last thing we should be worried about.
It really does seem like that is a concern that is a non-concern overall when you look at it. And really, when I was a kid, it was like Russia was this big, bad, evil power, and yet when we start looking at the numbers, they're really not all that much.
Well, it's after you remember they talk about that a lot, is after the collapse of the Soviet Union, especially after doing the START treaties and everything else. Actually, that was during the Soviet Union, but it was at the end of it. When Americans started going over to Russia quite a bit, especially to do missile inspection and things like that. I've met a lot of people who are involved in that, a lot of Americans it is, and they always said the same thing, which is that it is the paper tiger. I mean, we always worried about the Soviet Union, but when you get to see it in person, you realize how totally backwards it is. I mean, and what a totally impoverished country it is. I mean, the way I would describe it, if anyone's never been there, is, and I spent, a year living there, and I lived in the region for a number of years. It's sort of like, the worst part of Appalachia in the U.S. is definitely living better than the most parts of Russia. I mean, definitely, without the slightest doubt. It's just totally impoverished, totally backward, and it is not a threat to the United States. And the fact that they think that they are, and they think they're on par with the United States, I think is insulting, and they need to be taken off their high horse.
Russia, that really parlays neatly into exactly what my next question is, and that is that Russia has been really cranking up their economy to the best they can to outproduce Ukraine in this war as best they can. Do you see the support for Ukraine overcoming Russia's basically motivated economy in this regard? And in that same vein, how long do you see this war continuing, and what's the most likely outcomes?
So it's a good question, actually. The second question relates to the first one in my eyes. How does the war end, and how long does it take? My hypothesis has been the whole time, since only about a month into the war, is that it will not be a military victory of Ukraine that will end the war. It will not be liberating every inch, and the Russians accept that. What I think is much more probable is that Russia chooses not to fight anymore. That is, Russia chooses to withdraw. And how that would happen is not because Vladimir Putin's a nice guy. They would withdraw because they're no longer able to do so, either from economic or political or military standpoint. When I say economic standpoint, we see that today. Listen, the country's got a significant problem with inflation. There's shortages of carbon fuels, that is to say, petrol, gasoline. There's lines in Moscow to buy gasoline that stretch for miles. There's serious problems with unemployment in different parts of the country, not all, but some parts. There's a huge amount of flight of people, especially educated class, leaving. I think it was last year, I want to say there's 45,000 Russians about who were arrested on the U.S. border with Mexico. 45,000 who are trying to flee the country. Just think about that. That's Russians trying to jump the border from Mexico. And that's because the situation is that bad in Russia. So I think economic collapse could happen, in which case, Putin would have to call his troops back home. Now, what would be political collapse? Could be anything. It could be, Putin gets killed. It could be like Prigozhin, the Wagner group, starts to, show up and try to take power. Or it could be the oligarchs aligning into different groups and having sort of, let's say, civil war amongst themselves. But the other option is that there is a, military situation that transpires, like in 1917 or 16 for the Russians, when their military just was no longer able to engage in warfare. These troops were no longer willing to fight. And when they're no longer able to fight or willing to fight, and they just call it quits, or they start to kill their officers, or they no longer are obeying commands, that's when things get really dicey. And I think that could happen. We see a lot of examples of Russians killing their officers, fragging. It's becoming more prevalent than you would think. And I think there's a lot of signs that Russia could just one day not be able to hit the brakes and just go skidding out of control. And I think the country is in a much, much worse situation than what the West understands. And so I think at some point, Russia will be forced, whoever's in power, will be forced to bring the troops back to Russia, not because they care about or they love the Ukrainians, but because they simply are not able to maintain this ongoing, very expensive conflict in the neighboring republic.
I think you're on the right track there, and I think we're going to see how that turns out in the near future. Jason, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate every bit of the time you spend and the work you're doing supporting Ukraine.
Thank you, Brian. I appreciate your time.